colleagues, friends. Hi. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey,
Shawna Gann, nice to see you all. So the format of these webinars is just mainly kind of talk story. I'm really excited to have my guest here today. And so for those of you who are attending, feel free to keep your mic on mute. You don't even need to use your video. I'm sure you've been in Zoom meetings all day long. And so sort of like a podcast, you can just sit back and listen and use the chat as much as you'd like to ask questions or comment throughout, and we are going to have Q&A at the end. So with that, welcome. We're very excited to have you today. Well, we're going to be talking about privilege, power, and the role that leaders and individuals have to play. And my name is Kuʻulani Keohokalole. I'm the owner and consultant of People Strategies Hawaiʻi, and I focus on organizational development consulting with local businesses and nonprofit organizations. And I'm very excited to have my guest today. Shawna Gann is the host of Our True Colors. It's a podcast, and I'll let Shawna introduce herself.
Well, hi, Ku'u. Thank you for having me. So I'm really excited to be here. My name is Shawna Gann. I am originally from Anchorage, Alaska, and I am a military spouse. So I've gotten to live in all kinds of places, not just Alaska. We've lived in Europe a few places and also in Asia. So it's always been a big interest of mine to look at culture and kind of the different lenses we look at life through. And so, yeah, I'm a mom. I have two kids. They're kind of big kids, 21 and 18. And I am a consultant in the DC area. I do management consulting. But before that, I was actually a teacher for many years. I was an elementary school teacher for about 15, 16 years. And because of my roles in some of the things I did with like continuous school improvement, mentorship, etc., I kind of transferred over to more org development things and found myself studying business psychology. And that brings me to where I am today. My podcast really focuses on racial ambiguity or being racially ambiguous. And that really was born from my studies. So I'm working on my PhD and my dissertation focuses on the racially ambiguous women, to be specific. It's about women who have aspirations to be in executive positions and what that looks like in our world today as we talk about diversity and inclusion. So thank you so much for having me and inviting me to this discussion.
Yes, thank you. And Shawna and I connected on LinkedIn. Speaking of racially ambiguous, I felt a certain calling, a certain relevance to that label when I saw her announcement of her podcast on LinkedIn. So my background is I was born and raised in Hawaii. My mother is Native Hawaiian, Mexican, and Caucasian. My father is Black and Japanese. And so growing up, it's just been, and being an adult, it's very interesting to walk through this world with multiple perspectives and lenses on different things. And I think all of the world's recent events have really caused a lot of pause and reflection on my part in terms of the ways that I interact with other people in the world. So Shawna and I really want to delve into this topic today and hopefully help those of you who are attending just to hear from our perspective, hear what we've studied, but also maybe just to think through your own thoughts and how you're feeling and reacting to what's been coming up lately. So with that, let's kind of dive into it, Shawna. There has been talk about, the term racism, privilege, discrimination, prejudice. We use all of these words and sometimes we use them sort of as synonyms for each other, but could you help us just start with defining what these different terms mean?
Sure. So you're right. People do use them interchangeably a lot, but there are some very big differences and I'm happy to break that down. So prejudice really has to do with, it's just as the word sounds, prejudgment. Oftentimes there isn't even logic around it. It's just kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the schema that you've built around a person or an idea or a concept, without fully knowing it or understanding it. So you place judgment on something that you haven't really come to understand. Racism is really about a hierarchy, and it has to do with superiority. And so sometimes you'll hear somebody say something about reverse racism, and another person will counter and say there is no such thing as reverse racism. And that's hard to really understand because it is kind of abstract, but it's true. Racism cannot be reversed because it's about one person exerting, I don't want to say power, but or at least having a feeling of supremacy over another or superiority over another based on race. So anyone can be prejudiced, but if you think about at least, and please know that I'm coming from, I'm talking about the way we have experienced society in America and based on American history, because this might look very different in another place. But in the US, because of our history, when you think about particularly slavery, that what, I mean, people who were slaves coming in from Africa weren't even considered people, you know, so that would be, you can't go reverse because that's not the level of supremacy or the way supremacy works. So going a little bit further, people, you might hear institutional racism or institutionalized racism or systemic racism. And that goes even deeper. So if you're talking about like a racist, like an event that happens, it's usually it might be a targeted thing. For example, a person of color or a Black person's family, somebody might damage their home because of race. You know, I'm being very specific that way. However, the disparities that we see in the healthcare system, or the fact that some school districts are not getting as many resources as others because of the way that county lines are drawn or something like that, that's in the system. That's systemic racism. Does that make sense, those differences?
Yeah, I think so. I think, you know, as we think about the killing of George Floyd and all of these very blatant acts that were driven by, you know, racism against someone's skin color, it sometimes becomes, I don't want to say easy, but it becomes this thing where we think, well, that's just like, that's a very blatant racist act, but I don't have racism. That's, you know, I don't go around killing people, or I don't, you know, so it feels like it's just something that exists out there. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit more about how institutional racism shows up and maybe some examples of what that looks like.
Right. So I did give the example, for example, of healthcare for one. There are studies that have shown that, and it comes through mainly with Black women, actually, where Black women, for example, if they go in for an appointment and they're having pain or they're trying to explain some situation to a doctor, it has been shown that they are more likely to not be believed or to not be treated. So they might be sent home, okay, you'll be all right. Doctors might say that they don't really have as much pain as maybe they're saying, whereas a white woman would come in and say, I have this pain, I'm having this issue, and they get, you know, okay, take these pills, come back. And so that would be an example. And as I mentioned with schools, there are so many stories of school districts who get the hand-me-downs, if you will, when a new school opens somewhere else, and a lot of times, you know, these resources are coming from property taxes and from the community. So then we can bring in housing segregation. That's an issue. And, you know, it's a little tricky because it kind of is like under the radar. These are things that are, you know, we have laws in place. So one would say, like, you know, we can't have those things. You know, no way can we discriminate. That's against the law. But there are ways that it can happen. Redlining was something, you know, in the past where people would steer people away from certain communities. No, you know, we don't want to go to that community where the white, you know, community would be thriving, but they would begin to push people out of that area or drive up housing costs to discourage Black ownership or other people of color. And then we're starting to see kind of the opposite happen with gentrification, as there are communities within, the cities that are now becoming renovated and the prices are going up and driving people out. But because of systemic racism, there are studies that show that people of color, particularly Black people, get paid less. They don't get the same kinds of jobs. Therefore, they're not making the same income to be able to afford that same kind of housing. So it's just a cycle, and it's just built in so deeply that if you're not living that, if you're not experiencing that, to you, life is normal. Like, I got this apartment, why not? It looks great downtown now. Not really understanding that that situation has just driven a family out. Which might make it harder for them to work because maybe they don't have the transportation that's needed from a suburban communities, let's say. So that's the issue, is it just is running so deep, but kind of also under the surface where it doesn't seem like it should be a problem because we have laws against discrimination, yet the system has been around for long, or it's built in, and you have networks where people might give a favor to somebody else, or maybe you have a situation where realtors will show homes to some people but not others, and it's really hard to pinpoint those things. They're very covert, but they exist.
Yeah, I mean, and in Hawaii, we're no stranger to that, right? So when we look at statistics around education, around health, and incarceration, a lot of those things, Native Hawaiians are ranked among the highest in representation, overrepresentation in disparate areas. And there's some who will say, well, it's Native Hawaiians, they need to value education more, they need to value health more. But I think, to your point, we've got to look back to the history of how these things were founded, and the institutions that were set up in a very kind of white heteronormative way, that maybe are perpetuating some of those inequalities.
Right, and it is generational. Think about a family. I'll give you an example. Sometimes it seems automatic in some conversations for someone to say, oh, so you're saving for your son or your daughter's college, and where are they going to go to school? And as if it's automatic, but that is not an automatic thing for every family. Not every family can have a college fund, or talk about their retirement funds or savings or things like that. So there isn't something to pass along. And if you are in a family where you're fortunate to grow up with, money, even middle class, and that is just your norm, you don't see it any other way, you would assume that everybody else is going to follow the same thing. So when you try to relate that to another demographic who has been historically disadvantaged, let's say, because of these systems, it's really hard to understand that, like, why aren't you going to college? And that American dream, if you just work hard enough.
Yeah.
But you can't always just work hard enough. Some people have to work twice as hard just to get half as far, because of the way that things are. But
yeah, and just having, like, a lot of the things we take for granted, right? So having, let's say, parents who went to college themselves, and are college educated and can provide those things for you, sort of taking that for granted, or not realizing. I think a lot of the times when we talk about privilege, it's someone said it's like being born into air. Like, you just don't even know, right? You just don't even know the difference. It's just kind of what you're used to. But realizing, I think one of the biggest things about privilege is being aware of it, and realizing that we all, and I'm including myself in this, and I'm sure Shawna would too, that we all benefit from some sort of privilege in some aspect of our lives, and being aware of what that means, and and how that's played a role in where we are.
Exactly. I mean, oftentimes you'll hear people talk about white privilege. Well, you give your background, I'll talk about myself. I'm not white. I confuse a lot of people, which is why I talk about racial ambiguity, because I think I'm probably one of those folks. So I identify monoracially as Black, even though I don't have darker skin. My family's mostly Black. Oh, by the way, I also use the term Black over African American just because not everybody's from Africa. So I do, just so you know. But my father's side is Creole. And so that's also multiracial and very difficult to break down and explain, because Creole also embodies a culture. It's not just having to do with ethnicity, but that's why I look the way I look. And, you know, we were talking, there are things sometimes we do just because, and it's sad, and I'm going to tell you, it's a little difficult for me to even say this, but I'm going to be honest. Sometimes we do things to get ourselves a little bit closer to whiteness, because in our society in the US, that's what wins. So some examples. I have really super curly hair. If any of your I'm used to saying listeners, if anyone here knows what curl patterns are, you know, I'm about a 3C, which is like if you were to take a pin and wrap it around, that's how tight my curls are. Okay, like the Sharpie is like a 3B, I'm at like a 3C. Okay, but I have a very good relationship with my hair dryer and my flat iron. And as long as I've checked, and I really do this, it's sad, as long as I've checked the weather report and rain is not going to be in the area, or if I don't have to stand at a bus stop, or if the humidity level is not going to be too high, then I straighten my hair. And that is especially true when I feel like if I have a job interview or a very important meeting, or something that I think I'm going to have to impress somebody. And I think it's sad for myself and for other people that there's like this drive to impress so much that I have to change, and I don't have to, but that I choose to change my natural hair pattern or curl pattern, because I know that the Western style of beauty, the European, the Eurocentric, idealistic concept of beauty is what prevails. It's what people consider attractive. And if you're attractive, you get a little bit further ahead. And that makes it really hard when you start talking about anti-Blackness, and because that's what that is. That's me suppressing my Blackness to try to fit in, to try to feel like I am a person that can belong at this level. And even though it hurts to say and is ugly, we are kind of at a point in time right now where we're facing all of that ugly, and it's time to talk about these things. I think, you know, we have a lot of talk these days about self-care and self-love, and this is part of it. Yeah. To not try to iron out who we are, instead embrace who we are, and not flatten everything. You know, I mean, I still did it for today, but you know, and there's other things we do, you know. It's part of the Black culture, I'm going to be honest, to kind of change our hair around, you know. And there are people that are very into the natural styles, and there are people who are just not comfortable with that yet, because we haven't been fully embraced in order to do that. And so it's a little bit scary when you start a new job, or when you're a parent and you're going to a new school. I told you I'm a military spouse. We move a lot. So that means I have to give a first impression a lot of times. You know, I do that often. And it's like, how will I present myself this time? You know, and we shouldn't have to think about those things, but we do.
Right. Right. Yeah, you're totally hitting on something, and it may seem like, how is that related? But it's so true. It's like those things that maybe some folks take for granted, that just the way their hair is what's considered beautiful. And for some of us, that's not the case. We're having to contort and conform and adjust ourselves to be, you know, that sort of standard of beauty, right? Like, same like you, I can totally relate. It depends. And that you really made a light bulb go off for me. It's like, when it's something important, then, oh, I better cut down on all this like brownness, you know. I better like straighten my hair, wear a pencil skirt, like, God forbid I wear like a Hawaiian whatever, I have to look the part. And, you know, I think that that's part of the way that some of this has even influenced our psyche, and the way that we the way that we kind of walk in this world?
Well, I'll tell you, it is actually quite related because everyone does this to some degree, right? We all do. You dress up for something special. I think the difference is not everyone changes what would be their natural ethnic phenotypical characteristics, okay, to do something special. And we even sometimes change our language. I don't know if you've heard of code switching. That happens. And we all do that too. Like you don't talk the same with your friends and family as you would to a client. Okay. So everyone is familiar with this to some degree. Where it becomes an issue in terms of American culture and what we're facing these days when we look at what's happened with George Floyd or all of these other tragedies that have been race related is that we're not talking about switching from an informal setting to a formal setting. We're talking about people having to change who they are, sometimes to survive. I mean, just to get by, to be able to move up, to excel. So, and it's very unnatural. And I think it's important for people to realize some people wake up and they go to work and they're just themselves and bring their whole selves. We hear that. But some people have to put on, oh, I don't want to say a mask, not in these days, but they have to put on like I don't want to even say a persona, but you change your presentation.
Yeah.
And that might be your hair, that might be how you talk, or you just how you try to fit in with the other people that are around you. And there's a very recent study out. I can send you all of these resources to Ku'u if you don't have them, but where it shows that really the average corporation has only 8% of their employees are Black. So imagine being part of that 8%, and you want to be who you are, but you're surrounded by 92% of people who are not like you, but you've got to sort of fit in. And so how do we do that? We adapt. In a way, I did that, with our military travels. You go to another country, I still am going to be an American, but also I start to try to blend a little bit into my local surrounding. Well, think about that every day in your own country, in your own place of work or school or whatever. And that's what a lot of people face.
And it's exhausting. It is very exhausting to not be able to be yourself, to be your authentic self. One thing you made me think about is you're talking about code switching, and in Hawaii we have Pidgin, right, which is a language that got created when you had all these people working on the plantations and couldn't quite understand each other's languages, so they sort of formed a language. And like with my family, I talk Pidgin, and then I don't do that when I'm working with clients or giving a presentation and things like that. And that might be just as simple. You might just look at that, oh well, yeah, you're just adjusting to your audience. But when you really dig deeper, there's power to that, right? There's a power. I don't know what the term is, but if I were to talk Pidgin to a client, they might say, you know what, you're not professional, like we can't work with you, right? And so and that's where I think some of that privilege or that this differentiation comes in, is knowing that certain things are allowed and acceptable and valued in our society, and certain things are not.
I would even go as far as to say is they're expected, right? So think about, you go into a board meeting and it would be expected that you hold yourself a certain way or you look a certain way. And that might mean someone's making oh, maybe you should do this or you should do that. And every one of those little things that you're changing about yourself is making you less of who you are and more like who somebody wants you to be or thinks you should be. It's the same as in other countries, like with the skin lightening creams, just all of this hierarchy to whiteness, or really looking at it in the way of anti-Blackness. It shouldn't be that way. But we see that come out in so many different ways, and it's not realized often, because if you are a person that's able to enjoy a certain amount of racial privilege, it might not be visible to you unless pointed out, because for you it's your status quo, it's the norm, right?
So let's talk about, let's say, and I see all the list of great people we have here, and I know that the fact that you folks are here, you know, tells us a lot that you are invested in this and you're, you know, conscious of this. And so, Shawna, let's talk about if you are aware of this, but you're struggling with, so what do I do? How
Yeah.
do I show up? How do I support people of color? How do I delve into these conversations? They're really hard. And especially if I'm doing it at work, you
Yeah.
know, what are some best ways? So can you give some thoughts to that?
Sure. I mean, I'll first start by saying I don't have all the answers, and it is extremely hard. It's a touchy subject. It's one that's been taboo for years, right? And only recently are we able to touch on it, and now we have no choices in our faces, and we're living this. Um, I think the biggest thing is, and again, it depends on who you are. So I would like to say, by the way, even though I identify monoracially as a Black woman, I also acknowledge that I might not have white privilege, but I do have some light privilege, right? There is some difference there. And so that's hard for me to swallow sometimes, but I think that that same thought can be taken if you're a non-POC or non-person of color. I think the first thing is if you are a person who is non-Black, okay, because there are other POCs that are not Black, that we need to come at this from a place of humility. This is a time to really be humble, to acknowledge that we don't know it all, to acknowledge that it's scary. There's a lot going on right now. There's a lot that you may not know because it wasn't part of your culture growing up.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's hard to ask questions because you don't want to ask the wrong thing, or you want to show your support for someone, but you're afraid it might be cheesy or the wrong thing. One example recently, I think Tuesday, they did Blackout. There was Blackout Tuesday where people were putting up Black screens for their social media profiles, etc. And that is good to a degree because it shows that you care. It shows that you're aware, but that's kind of the limit there. So some might call that like a performative action where you're okay, I did it, but it's not really solving or showing solidarity with the community. It's about taking it that next step. So after listening, after showing awareness, being humble, you know, coming at this with humility, then I think it's appropriate to ask whomever you're having dialogue with, can I ask you some questions? And I would say, ask for permission because I think it's important to know that people are hurting. People are really hurting. And maybe they're not ready to talk about things. And so I guess that brings me to the next point where we live in an age where we can find out just about anything. And I think it's everyone's responsibility to educate themselves. It should not be the person of color's responsibility to educate you. However, if you ask permission, can I ask you some questions? There are some things that I don't understand. I think that's a lot better than just expecting to be taught or to
Mhm.
be shown or to put that burden on them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. It's I was telling Shauna, it's it feels like a very vulnerable time, and I think we can all relate to that feeling. But especially, I think being a person of color, it's having seen these things play out, and I tell people, I'm like, we essentially watched George Floyd get murdered on national TV. I consider that national TV because everybody saw it, right? And sorry, I have a special guest trying to join our talk right now. Um, but to think like that could have been me, that could have been one of my relatives, that could be that degradation or the devaluation of life based on someone's skin color is like that hits so close to home. And at least for me, my reflection has been like, wow, we're in 2020 and we think we have all this progress, right? And then to watch that happen, it just sort of makes you feel like, well, then, you know, it just, I don't know. I'm echoing what you're saying about feeling hurt, feeling hopeless, frustrated.
Cool, I'm with you. I think I spent about 2 days kind of in a daze, like, okay, I have to, like, I have responsibilities. I need to get to them. But my brain, like, I was so um, in shock. And the bad part is I was in shock, but I was not surprised
Yeah.
because we just saw before we're not even through understanding what happened in the Ahmaud Arbery case when we find out about Breonna Taylor and we find out about George Floyd and all of the and someone else, they're came up today. And I think just days before this, there was Christian Cooper just trying to watch birds in the
Birds.
park when a woman wielded her whiteness as a weapon.
Mhm.
Um, and it's disturbing. And I think it's also important to realize if you are a person of color or if you're a Black person of color, that everyone is processing this. You
Mhm.
know, I think about my family and and the hurt and the fear for my brothers and all that's there, my sisters. But I have to also acknowledge that other people are processing this too.
Mhm.
That being said, I think it's very important that when you are having conversations with people, if you are a white person or a non-Black POC, that you are really sensitive to the fact that while we all have struggles
Mhm.
and we all have challenges, and I don't even know if we have time to get into intersectionality, but we all have these things. We need to acknowledge that the original sin of slavery is still with us. There has never been atonement for that. And while there may have been emancipation, while laws may have changed, during the civil rights movement so that, you know, there's no longer segregation and we have discrimination laws and we're protected at work under EEO, that doesn't stop attitudes.
Mhm.
And that doesn't stop how people act based on those attitudes. And even if we're processing things differently and we're all hurting in one way or another, I think it's important to acknowledge that Black Americans
Mhm.
really feel this in a very deep, deep, different way.
Yeah.
Does that make, I mean, so not to diminish anyone's
No, I can appreciate that.
that, but I think it's important to keep that in mind when you're having conversations.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. I really appreciate that. There's this concept of oppression Olympics, where, sometimes we get into, and I've seen the debates online, people will get into, well, we had it bad. Well, Asian Americans had it bad. Well, Native Americans had it bad, and we do this like this sort of tit for tat, like let's argue over who had it worse. And I think you make such a good point that that's not what we're talking about right now. And so just being mindful that we're really, focused on how do we support our Black American community? How do we be there, show up as, allies, or in solidarity with, and do that in such a way that's respectful and humble and realizes our place in that.
Yeah.
I love what you were saying about ways to step into the conversations at work. I guess some of the things I've been reflecting on too. So there's an interesting resource called White Supremacy Culture, and I'm going to share that with those who attended today, in the email. And I know it sounds really radical, and when we think white supremacy, we immediately think of the Ku Klux Klan and the white hoods and all that kind of stuff. But if you actually read the resource, it talks about how a lot of our institutions were based on this culture of, whiteness being the model or the mode within which we all operate. And so a lot of the ways our organizations work, and even things like being professional, right? Even that term, what that means, and so like we've talked about the hair and all that kind of stuff, that we've got to question even those practices. So I'll give you an example. One of the things it talks about is being the first person to speak in a meeting, and not acknowledging that there are other, perspectives in the room, and or maybe you do acknowledge that, but just kind of you're always the first person to speak, or not including input, things like that we may not make that connection at all, but important for us to realize that this, how pervasive this is in our everyday experiences in the workplace. Shawna, you look like you want to add to that.
No, I'm just thinking it's important to have that cultural awareness and to be aware of oneself, like, oh, is that something I do? So no, please go on. I'm with you.
There were other things it talked about. I mean, it's a really long resource, so there's a lot of really good gems in there. But another one it talked about was just the way that we give appreciation. And are we being mindful of giving credit where credit is due? Or are we appreciating the same people over and over and not acknowledging people who had hands in certain things? Or even giving them an opportunity to be involved in things where they can get some recognition and appreciation.
Right.
There are a lot of different examples, but I guess my point is when I read that resource, I thought, oh my gosh, the light went off in my head because as much as, the George Floyd situation and Ahmaud Arbery can seem distant and not even near us, the systems that made that okay are sort of the same systems that we operate in without even knowing it sometimes, and can have an impact on the way that we interact with each other in work and in our families as well.
And communities. I mean, I recently had a conversation because there's going to be a demonstration near my home, and some neighbors were like, "We don't even have a problem here. Why would we even do that?" And our policemen, they're great, but it's about acknowledge. It's not. It is George Floyd. I mean, we are thinking about what happened to him, but it was like this incident with him was more like the last straw that broke the back of this broken down, starved, camel. And it's all a reflection of the entire problem. So it's not just police brutality. It's not just George Floyd. While we certainly care about George Floyd and it hurts what happened to him and that we saw that, we witnessed that, it's that we need to be reflecting on what that means for the whole. Like, why is this still happening? And to your point, in the workplace, it's tricky because there are some things that tend to go unsaid or that we don't address in the workplace because you just don't talk about those things, right? But to make sure that you are including people and providing opportunities for growth. Sometimes we don't even know. People are often gravitated to others that look like them. We were watching Devil Wears Prada, and there's a line kind of at the end where, Meryl Streep said, so, I see a lot of you in me. Well, maybe the people that we should be promoting shouldn't be who we see ourselves in, because that kind of perpetuates things. It's easy to do that, but sometimes we need to do things that aren't easy. And because what happens is we get these little informal networks that form, and sometimes it might be just a little chat and, like at a coffee shop or happy hour, or maybe a few people go out after work. But what's happening is relationship building and exchange of information that might be casual, but be very meaningful. And when you're not including other people or bringing other people into that conversation, they're missing out on that networking, that relationship building, which lends itself to a mentorship, sponsorship, championing another person. So I think it's very important what you're saying, to be mindful of how we include people and what we include people. Yeah.
And that's the thing is, as I've been working with organizations who are starting to craft their statements and what they want to say, because I think there's a lot of companies who feel, and that's good. They feel a sense of, I don't want to use the term obligation, that's not the right term, but they feel a sense of responsibility to speak out and say something about the issue. One of the things that I'm working to do as an OD person is to say, well, like, take a step. This is how moms do, we multitask, right? Is to take a step back and reflect on your organizational culture and practices.
Yes.
And have you truly been whatever you're about to say in that statement, right? So if you're about to say, like I saw Uber's email today, we stand with Black communities, or, there's a lot of companies coming out with things. Well, like before you even say that, let's review history and let's look at what are show us, right? Proof is in the pudding. Like, how have you actually done it? Because I think one of the things that my friends of color and I have been talking about is like we're tired of hearing you're listening. You know, like listening was something we should have been doing all this time, and people have been talking all this time. So it's about action at this point, and it, you know, we'd rather like you save the words and then actually show us in your action and how you're demonstrating that in your practices and the way that you promote people, who you're hiring, who you're giving voice to, who you're promoting, who you're engaging with in the community. Like show it through your action, and less about, you know, trying to get a word out there or trying to say, look, I'm an ally. I think that's the challenge.
Right. And I think even to take it further, like you said earlier, maybe it's a time for vulnerability, or like I was saying, for humility. If you want to put a statement out, that's fine too. And if you probably aren't where you should be, to say that.
Mm.
We recognize that we have not taken all the steps that we need to be more inclusive or to be more supportive of this community or whatever it is. But then don't stop there. You have to go on with, and our plan is,
Yeah.
right? Because thank you for acknowledging it. But now what?
Yeah.
We've been, you know, it's the same as like every time we see these horrific mass shootings, you know, people are like, we've got to do something. This is horrible. And then some time goes by and then we're complacent again. And then it happens again because there isn't action. And I think, I mean, I was describing to somebody, I feel like we're on this strange precipice right now where it's like a tipping point where if we're not careful, just because of some of the other dynamics, some of the other variables that are happening, we could either become very, very divisive, or we could just go all the way on the other side and find ourselves being way more united. I feel like we're headed towards the united side, but it does take that action. You know what I'm saying? Like, you can't just have the words, even though we know that's what we're supposed to do. And that's the truth, even in your personal lives. You know, the word ally, for the first time, I hadn't really thought about it. We hear people saying, I'm expressing solidarity or I'm an ally. And I was questioned in another discussion recently, like, is allyship enough? I was like, well, I kind of thought that was what we do. But looking into it, you know, some people define allyship or being an ally as like blacking out your social media box to show like, I am aware of this, I'm supporting this, but I'm going to just do that from here, you know. Whereas when you show solidarity, you're rolling up your sleeves and you're getting in there with the person. You're getting in there with the community. That's kind of the difference. So I'd say being an ally is putting out a statement. Showing solidarity is putting out a statement and showing what your action plan is.
Yeah.
No matter where you are on that continuum.
I agree. And I think if we talk about privilege as having power, that's sort of unearned because it's just, like we said, you're born into air. You're not aware of it, but you've inherited that power in our society. Then I think the opposite of that is giving up some of that power. And it should feel a little painful. It should feel uncomfortable. It should feel awkward. It should feel, you know, like doing a hashtag is not, that doesn't cost me anything. Like I can just do that and then I can just go about my day. My next post can be about what I ate for lunch. Like, it's like what I hear you saying is a solidarity is really like, I'm in it with you, which means that I may lose friends over this. I may, you know, lose my job over this. I may, like, this may really pain me as a person, but I'm with it. I'm in it, you know. That's kind of the difference I see between like what you're saying, ally, I'll support you from here versus I'm in it with you.
That's right. And it's not easy. I mean, it's human nature to conserve, right? You want to save what you've got.
Yeah.
So what? Give up what? You know, and again, it's like sometimes you don't even know until those privileges are highlighted. And that's pretty tough. And that's where a lot of those conversations about reverse racism come in, or reverse discrimination. For example, things like affirmative action. People often misunderstand affirmative action. Affirmative action isn't about quotas, or it's not about tokenism, having someone to check a box. It's really about providing opportunity, similar to the Rooney Rule. I talk about the Rooney Rule a lot for anyone who likes football. You know, basically, you know, it was realized like there were no Black head coaches. it was like, well, why not? Well, it's because there's kind of a buddy system. Oh, there's a position open up. I got this friend, whatever. And so the rule was to expand that pool. So there had to be two in the pool, they call it, at least one or two other people, that were different than you. That would be some diverse candidate to have a chance. And if the qualifications are the same and that person can bring the enrichment of their whatever it is that's from their perspective, their diverse perspective, that could actually be a bigger benefit. And that's the business case for diversity. We don't have to get out into that, but it's basically the same thing. When you feel like, oh no, if I take that on, then I lose my opportunities. And it's really hard to do that, So we're asking people, it's a big ask, but
yeah,
if you want to change, that's what it requires.
yeah, absolutely. We've had some great comments coming in and questions, so I want to address some of those. Let's see, Christina said she's so intrigued and totally resonates with this concept of being racially ambiguous. For so long, she always felt like she never completely fit in and then eventually just embraced it. Yeah. Thank you for that, Christina.
Yeah.
Let's see. Deb, did I miss anything above that? No. Okay. Deb, any thoughts on how we address the idea that Hawaii is beyond racism? There was a New York Times piece last year, and I'd love to chat about how we can lead more conversations about racism, white supremacy culture, and systems of oppression in Hawaii. Yeah, Deb, thank you for bringing that up. I was sharing with Shawna that in Hawaii, things are a lot more kind of nuanced, and we don't necessarily have these very honest, raw, open conversations about race, which leads us to down this whole path of like, we're a paradise, melting pot, that whole BS. And I guess my immediate thought is, just ask the people who experience it on a daily basis. I could tell you story after story of the way that I've been treated in different places here. And I'm sure there's a lot of voices of people who could share that. So I think that's one, is asking people to talk about their own experiences of racism here in Hawaii. But I think it's even understanding that there's a lot of the history that underlies the places that we work in. So really understanding Hawaii's history will help bring light to a lot of the things. If you think about the Massey case and some other stories in our past, it'll help you to really open your eyes to the ways that things have been built and operated. So I take you up on that offer to help lead more conversations about it, because I think we need to bring more awareness to it. I said she agrees the literature that affected her was white privilege. Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack made her see many signs of systemic racism in our society. Yeah. And then Kathy said, I'd love to spend more time with the issues of white supremacy culture and some of the ways that shows up uniquely in Hawaii. Christina says, this is very helpful. We were just having this conversation today about what it means for our organization to take action. Yeah. And I think a lot of folks are at that place where, and especially, those of you, like I said, who are tuning in today, you're tuning in because you care about this and are at that place where they want to take action. They've acknowledged that this is wrong and they want to be part of the solution to do something. So I think all of the suggestions that you had, Shawna, were really good about coming at it from a humble place of, we don't know it all. We need to ask, we need to get ourselves educated. There's a lot of resources and readings out there. So Shawna and I have pulled some of that together. We're going to send out to you in the recording that you can start to read yourself. I think white privilege is another really good one. There's white fragility. Shawna, I don't know if there's other books or articles.
I recommend it often. It's called Waking Up White. It's more of a narrative of someone's life and how she came about, rather than an instructional guide, but it's very enlightening as well.
There's one specifically more about Hawaii called Asian Settler Colonialism. I don't know if that's the name of it, but I remember it is about that concept of Asian settler colonialism. So that would be interesting to look at in terms of Asian Americans who came to Hawaii and then, through the system, like sort of benefited off of what colonization brought to Hawaii as well. So that would be interesting to read. Yeah, so we'd be happy to share resources. I think the other thing is, like you're saying, delving into the conversation, so not shying away from it. One of the things Shawna and I were talking about right before this was, now that it's Pride Month, I think that, so I'll just speak for myself and Shawna can give her own opinion on this, but one thing that I'm just going to say kind of frustrated me was listening to some of the narratives this week about, these issues like with George Floyd and all of that, like tie right to Pride. And so let's focus on Pride because it's Pride Month. And I think we've got to be careful about completely washing over these issues. And again, not to say that those two things are not connected, but just being mindful that we're really having an intentional conversation about race and discrimination. But I'm going to let Shawna also give her her angle on that.
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I think I just kind of think of it a little. First of all, I don't like that we have to break things up by it's time for this discussion because it's or that month, that's all. Like I said, I was a teacher, so it's kind of like this dictated my bulletin board. It's like, okay, it's February now, it's March, it's Women's History. So that aside, I think that it is possible to do both. I just think that it's important to be specific about the conversation you're going to have at the moment. So if you are having an event and it's for Pride, like, as I said earlier, we should still acknowledge that different groups of people continue to have challenges. Mm-hmm. I don't think this should diminish those challenges. I think it's just important to acknowledge the differences in them, if that makes sense. So if you're going to have an event or put out a piece of, something you're publishing, then I think it's important to specify, well, this is happening right now. And we stand in solidarity. We understand the importance of this. For the moment, we're going to turn our focus to this issue. We're going to talk about Pride, or Pride Month, and LGBTQ plus issues for this conversation, because we can still have other conversations. I recently did an episode I had a therapist and a communications specialist, and one of the questions I asked was, because I had a listener. It was like, this is a good question. A listener wrote in and was like, I don't know. I don't feel like I can talk about things because I feel like I'm unimportant compared to this because I'm not a Black person. Mm. She's like, she's a POC, but she's not a Black person of color. So she's like, I don't, there was feelings of shame and guilt. And one of the things that came out of that was like, guilt isn't a very useful emotion.
Yeah.
Shame doesn't help you. It might bring awareness to the situation, but you have to do something, right? And by the way, you can still acknowledge who you are. You don't have to say, I'm not worthy of any, or like my pains aren't valid because it's not the same pain, but you still need to be sensitive to what's happening. And just, I would say, bracket it. Right? Like, this is the conversation we're going to have, or the event we're going to have, or whatever. Just bracket that. We acknowledge this, but this is what we're discussing right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I like, you and I were talking earlier about how people of color were not monolithic. So they're, that all impacts us as well. So, yeah,
right.
I like that.
Yeah, my experience is going to be the same as, someone else's. So, yeah.
So as we kind of get to wrapping up, I think a lot of the things you pointed out about humility, about asking questions, about educating ourselves, knowing that we don't have all the answers, stepping into these conversations. I guess I would add really taking some time to look inside and internally about where have I benefited from privilege, or where might there be times where I should have been listening more or doing something about some sort of inequity, whether it's in your family, in your workplace, or in the community, and what role did I have to play in that? And in this very moment in time, what role do I have going forward to maybe change some of those behaviors or do things differently? I liken it to getting an apology from someone. It's like, if someone just says, oh, I'm really sorry, I feel bad. Like, to your point about guilt, it's like, I feel really bad, Shawna. I hurt your feelings. I feel bad. That doesn't really do much.
Right.
I mean, you might be like, okay, but if I do that over and over and over, it'd be very empty. And so it's got to say, this is what I did wrong. and these are the actions I'm going to take to do things differently going forward in the future. I think that's that's where the true work is, and then it's the actual accountability to doing those actions. And right.
Accountability is important. And if I can, I just want to say another thing is we don't all have to take action the same way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, some people want to protest, and that is their right to do so. And you know, we're hoping they're doing it safely, but and respectfully. But that's the right. Some people don't want to do that. They want to help in other ways, and that could be writing letters. That could be really, and again, back to educating yourself. Find out who your local, you know, people are, who's holding public office. Even I say even down to the school board. You know, these are people in power, and these are people who are influencing our policy. And so the next step, of course, is to make sure you're registered to vote, and then vote. You know, encourage other people to do that. That's how you make changes to systems.
Yeah.
So you at the personal level, at the individual level, but if we're trying to get down to make some systemic change, you gotta vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And look to change policies and systems. Sorry. Of course, it came up right now. So are there any last questions from anyone, or any last comments that folks want to make to this conversation? Are you saying hi? Yeah, I just want to thank you, Shawna. I think that you really helped to shed light on just helping us think a little bit more globally about this, helping us to define some of these terms that we hear thrown around a lot, and then giving us some really tangible actions that we can take going forward to be part of the solution. One of the things I will say as a mom is just really trying to educate my kids. And you know, it starts even with that, right? It starts even with the way they treat each other, the way they talk to each other and think about the world. I mean, even like you mentioned the hair thing, and sometimes my girls are watching me do my hair and saying, why are you straightening your hair? You know, and we have that conversation, right? So just being cognizant, those of you who are parents or around your nieces and nephews, being cognizant of the ways that we're raising our children up to be people who, you know, are in solidarity as well, and and are educated and aware of these things. Any last thing? Yeah, Shawna, go ahead.
I was just going to thank you. No, I think I don't have any final thoughts for now, other than to say thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. It is a tough one, very important one, and so I appreciate you letting me take part. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Shawna, and thank you, everyone. And I'm actually really glad that it's ending like this, because I know that it's like a really heavy topic, and I know it's a Friday, and so I hope that seeing my daughter play with my hair is making you laugh right now, and sending you off with a great weekend. So thank you, everyone, and take care. Aloha. Thanks so much. Thanks, Shawna. That was fantastic.
Aloha, thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen.
That is a great image. That's perfect. Oh, how sweet. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Nice job, y'all.
Thank you. Oh my gosh, my husband was supposed to be watching this one.
That's okay. I have one dog here and one here, and this one's nudging me. So I don't know if you saw. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, you gotta do the super subtle. Usually I have my cell phone near me because they like to watch videos on my phone. So as soon as they start coming, I'm like, here, take my phone.
Yeah, but I love it because it's, I mean, I think actually this entire situation with COVID has kind of made everyone feel a little bit more, maybe not casual, but like we all have families, you know, it's fine. Hi.
Say hi. This is Aria. Say hi.
Aria?
Yeah.
Oh, my daughter is Ariana.
Oh, nice. Very cute. So thanks so much, Shawna. This was really great. And it was like therapeutic for me, I think, to just talk it out with you.
I'm glad.
Yeah.
God, me too. I even though they're tough, I enjoy these conversations because I feel like it takes us, nothing happens if you don't say anything, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Awesome. Okay,
Well,
cool. Well, yeah, I'll send you the recording. And then just let me know if you need any extra audio or whatever for your podcast. You know, I'm happy to record anything else.
Oh, okay. I'll let you know. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yes.
What time is it now for you? 5:30-ish.
5:30 and what? It's 11:30 for you, right? Yeah. Thank you so much. I so appreciate it.
I'll see you soon.
Okay, take care. Bye.
Hi, Mom.